Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is Professor Arvind Tiwari, Professor of Criminology in the School of Law, Rights and Constitutional Governance, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. We will discuss about the module on aftercare and rehabilitation of released prisoners. The presentation would have the following sections: 1. Introduction; 2. The origin of aftercare and rehabilitation of released prisoners; 3. The aim of rehabilitation; 4. Scope of aftercare assistance; 5th. Legal aid and protection; 6th. Impediments in the implementation of aftercare programs in India; 7th. Role of police and correctional officers in rehabilitation and social reintegration of released prisoners; 8th. Aftercare and rehabilitation services and overview; 9th. The present situation of aftercare and rehabilitation and the way forward. Now, the concept of aftercare and rehabilitation of released prisoners, I would start the discussion on this issue. The concept of aftercare and rehabilitation of released prisoners from the correctional institutions owes its origin into the penological thought that regards reformation and rehabilitation as the ultimate aim of criminal justice administration. Aftercare, being a vital link in the correctional cycle, has been conceived as an approach and as a service designed to reduce the offender's social isolation and dependence, to help him to get over his social handicaps, to remove the stigma that darkens his her present and future life because of institutionalization, and finally to accelerate the process of his her rehabilitation as a mentally, socially and vocationally well adjusted person. It also contemplates to provide a set of pre-designed programs which are organized for the care, supervision and guidance of an ex-institutionalized prisoner, and also to the various activities that are directed towards his her acceptance by the family and the community. Now, we will discuss about how aftercare is important. Aftercare of prisoner is an extension of the care and attention meted out to them when they had been in a jail. The person in a prison is often a victim of circumstances, and his detention period needs to be utilized for giving him and her training and equipping him with skills which would help him to rehabilitate himself and function as an efficient and useful member of the society. The training has to be continued, and the aftercare program needs to be viewed as a necessary step in the contemplate rehabilitation of the individual. Aftercare is not a kind of benevolent activity intended to rescue neither a fallen individual nor a sort of patronage extended by superior persons. Aftercare is rather based on the understanding of the needs and outlook of the person who is going out of a correctional institution to face an unkind and inhospitable world outside. The released prisoner starts with a trauma, a psychological damage. So, this in the annual report of the Children Aid Society, you can find little more detail of this kind of description. Now, aftercare services have to heal this rejection trauma by way of restoring his lost self-confidence and rehabilitate him back in the community as a productive and useful citizen. More recently, New Model Prison Manual 2003 has rightly observed that the process of aftercare and rehabilitation of offender is an integral part of institutional care and treatment. These two should never be delinked. The aftercare of a prisoner is an extension of the institutional treatment program. Hence, the administrative machinery for carrying out these programs should be effectively integrated with the Department of Prisons. Now, I will give the brief historical background of aftercare. Now, despite indisputable importance of the aftercare services for the rehabilitation of ex-inmates of prisons, until the beginning of the 20th century, no significant work was undertaken in this century except for some sporadic efforts made by some philanthropic organizations that organize some small societies for the help of the ex-convict. The earlier recorded effort is reflected in the starting of small funds called the Cloyd Martin Funds, the first of which was raised in 1893 in the United Provinces. The Indian Jails Conference 1877, although considered this issue but did not support the idea of setting up of discharged prisoner aid society in this country, as the conference mentioned that, I quote, "The prisoners here find much less difficulty in finding their place in the society than they do in England," unquote, full stop. The Uttar Pradesh, then known as the Northwest Province and Awadh, took the initiative under the leadership of Sir John Taylor, the then Inspector General of Prisons, to organize a central society in 1894 for extending help by way of affording aid, financial or otherwise, to needy prisoners on their discharge. The society ceased to function since 1902 because of discontinued public interest and sympathy. This society was revived again in 1930 in Lucknow. The name of the society subsequently changed as the UP Crime Prevention Society. The society is still functioning with its branches in every district, known as District Crime Prevention Society. Prisoners' aid societies came into existence in Calcutta, Bombay, now Mumbai, and Madras, and now known as Chennai, in 1907, 1914 and 1921 respectively. In Bengal, the West Bengal Aftercare Association for Juveniles and Adolescent Offenders was established in 1928 with a view to supervising and organizing the rehabilitative work for juvenile and adolescent offenders released from borstal and reformatory schools. In Maharashtra, in addition to Prisoners' Aid Society, which was established in 1914, another aftercare association was set up in 1916 for providing assistance to the juvenile offenders discharged from the reformatory school in Bombay. The Sheffield Aftercare Association, which was merged in 1951 with the Bombay State Probation and Aftercare Association, was the continuation of earlier effort. One released prisoners aid society is functioning at Pune by the name Navjivan Mandal, and similar societies were formed in central provinces and Barar in 1925, in the Punjab in 1927, and in Delhi in 1935. Since the inception, these societies functioned as voluntary agencies. However, in some states, they received some financial grant from their respective state government. Mostly, these societies rendered assistance to discharge indigent prisoners with view to reclaim habitual offenders from a life of crime, casual and juvenile offenders from becoming habitual and carrying on researches and public education in all matters relating to prisoners and prisons. Now, I will tell something about the various committees like Indian Jails Committee 1919, the UP Jails Committee 1929 stressed the need for shifting the emphasis from the punishment of offender to their reformation and recommended the adoption of such measures in allotting prison labor, which will ultimately be useful for them in obtaining jobs on being released from the prisons. In 1954, the Central Social Welfare Board appointed an advisory committee on aftercare with a view to, I will now quote, assess the extent to which the existing aftercare services met the requirements for the rehabilitation of society and socially and physically handicapped person after their release from the institutions. 2. Suggest the ways and means to overcome the problems of rehabilitation and to indicate the manner in which pre-discharge policies and practices of institutions might be modified for the effective implementation of aftercare programs. The main recommendations of the committee relating to social and vocational rehabilitation were: number 1, issuing of letters of recommendations by the aftercare agencies; number 2, finding suitable placement for the discharged inmates; number 3, removal of restriction on the employment of ex-convicts; number 4, reservation of jobs for the physically handicapped; 5th, providing small loans to promote employment and organizing producers cooperatives; and number 6, setting up small scale industrial unit and providing free legal aid. The committee observed that there was no coordination between the training imparted inside the institution and the employment opportunities available outside. The committee recommended that aftercare services should be organized on a national basis. It is very important to mention here that the All India Jail Manual Committee 1957 emphasized the importance of aftercare services and recommended that these services should be developed as an essential requisite in the correctional field. The All India Seminar on Correctional Services held in New Delhi in March 1969 recommended several steps to improve the aftercare services. Model Prison Manual 2003 has recommended that the Industries Department of the state government should formulate a scheme for the employment of released convicts in small scale industrial units. This aside, big industrial houses should be motivated at the level of prison headquarters to give preference in jobs to released prisoners in the interest of their rehabilitation and social adjustment. More recently, New Model Prison Manual 2016 prepared by Ministry of Home Affairs, Government of India stated, and I quote, "The process of aftercare and rehabilitation of offenders is an integral part of institutional care and treatment. These two should never be delinked. The aftercare of a prisoner is an extension of the institutional treatment programs. Hence, the administrative machinery for carrying out these programs should be effectively integrated with the Department of Prisons. It is clear that aftercare and each and every inmate leaving the prison do not require follow-up service. A large number of prisoners coming from the rural areas and agrarian and business communities are generally accepted back into their family. They are re-assimilated in the social milieu without much difficulty. They require only some continued contact with their kith and kin and some pre-release counseling to bridge the gap between their life in the prison and that in the free society. There are other prisoners who resist follow-up action as they consider it a kind of surveillance on them. But majority of the inmates would welcome such programs which help them settle in the society after their release and get from rehabilitated beyond the possibility of reverting to crime. Unquote. The aim of rehabilitation. Now I will start the aim of rehabilitation. According to Williams, the primary aim of rehabilitation of a prisoner is, I quote, to make the transition from the prison community to the free community as smooth as painless as possible by giving the prisoner financial and material assistance and psychological instruction, counseling and guidance, and by offering or imposing some degree of continuing supervision where this is desirable. Help may be needed in obtaining employment, in obtaining accommodation, in re-establishing his position in the family, in settling various debts incurred while he was in custody or prior thereto, and in countless other directions. The concept of rehabilitation closely follows from the medical model being absorbed in penological thinking. Now, I will come to the objectives of aftercare. According to New Model Prison Manual 2016, the objectives of the aftercare services are, I quote, 1. Extending help, guidance, counseling, support and protection to all released prisoners whenever necessary. Next, helping the released prisoners to overcome his or her mental, social and economic difficulties. Next, the helping in the removal of any social stigma that may have been attached to the inmate or his or her family because of his incarceration. Next, impressing upon the individual the need to adjust his or her habits, attitudes, approaches and values to a rational appreciation of social responsibilities and obligations and the requirements of community living. Next, helping the individual in making satisfactory readjustment with his or her family, neighborhood, work group and the community per se. Next, assisting in the process of the individual's physical, mental, vocational, economic, social and attitudinal post-release readjustment and ultimate rehabilitation. Now, I will come to the scope of aftercare assistance. The scope of aftercare assistance will be determined by the district committee and may include the following matters: subsistence money to cover initial expenditure after release till such times as the released person reaches his or her family or obtains employment, provision of food, temporary accommodations till housing arrangement are made, stay in a district shelter or aftercare hostel or stay at home wherever available, assistance in securing housing in urban areas, assisting in securing apprenticeship in a workplace, technical institute, industry or trade, supply of artisan's tool or trade equipment. Next will be the assistance in starting a cottage industry, any small business trade, a small or a stall. Next could be assistance in getting employment. Next is assistance in getting land, agriculture, equipment, drought or milk cattle and seeds for those opting to take up agriculture. Next would be assistance in starting a small dairy, poultry, duck, sheep or piggery vegetable farms. Now, next would be liaison with an assistance to prisoner's family during the period he or she is serving a prison sentence. Help in maintaining continuity in relationship with family, neighbors, employers and community. Next would be preparing the family, employer and neighborhoods for receiving the individual after release. Guidance in getting married and setting up of a home and resetting in the life. Liaison with local police so that she is not harassed unnecessarily. Next section is now legal aid and protection. Number 1. The following aid and protection may be required. 1. Help in all matters relating to the resettlement and rehabilitation of released prisoners. The aftercare agency should be closely associated with the planning of the aftercare program for the inmate. Number 2. The plan of aftercare of a prisoner should be subject to such changes as would be found necessary by the aftercare services. 3. The probation or welfare or rehabilitation officer should intensify his work during the pre-release period. He should maintain all the prescribed records under the direction of the superintendent. 4th, after release from the institution, the case of a released person should be followed for a period ranging from 1 to 5 years according to the requirements of each case. 5th, the probation or welfare or rehabilitation officer shall establish follow-up study through interviews or correspondence. A 6-monthly report evaluating the released person's adjustments and resettlement should be prepared by him, and copies of it should be sent to the record branch in the headquarters organization. 6th, the record branch in the headquarters should maintain all the case files and follow-up reports according to the central indexing system. Now, I would discuss about the impediments in the implementation of aftercare programs in India. The Committee on Aftercare Program recommended for a very sound and a practical base for the aftercare infrastructure and program in this country. The committee emphatically advocated for reorienting and revitalizing the educational, vocational and trade training programs both in care and correctional institutions, keeping in view the requirements of the competitive employment market which the released inmates would be expected to meet. The committee also called for the introduction of modern tools and equipments for training for the inmates to work as per requirements of modern industries and development of adequately trained that competent cadre of trainers to impart effective training to the inmates in correctional and aftercare institutions. The main crux of the aftercare institutions would bring about the desired changes or modifications in the behavior of inmates by way of imparting appropriate types of vocational training, rendering guidance, counseling and follow-up services. Unfortunately, because of many hindrances such as the aftercare programs in this country have not been able to make significant headway towards satisfactory rehabilitation of released prisoners. One of the significant hurdles which come in the way is lack of meaningful communication between the institutional program and the governmental and community services in the field of aftercare employment, vocational counseling and training and rehabilitation. The existing communication channel between release offenders and aftercare institution is really inadequate to bridge the gap between what the institutions can offer and what a release offender can really avail himself of those services. Another impediment is the lack of proper coordination between the governmental and voluntary efforts in matter of organizing aftercare services. Voluntary organizations are found to work in isolation without getting adequate support and incentives neither from the government nor from the public. The stigma attached to persons for their being in the correctional institutions, in combination with the general public apathy and the lack of cooperation of the family members of the ex-convicts, poses serious problems for the proper rehabilitation of offenders. The lack of active governmental support, insufficient infrastructural facilities, inadequate financial backup, and want of trained personnel and training equipment have also been identified as major handicap in the fruitful utilization of aftercare services for the socio-economic rehabilitation of institutionalized offenders. It is interesting to note that some police authorities and jurisdictions have initiated innovative schemes to facilitate social rehabilitation of prisoners. In this regard, two experiments initiated by Mumbai Police and Rajasthan Police are worth mentioning. In 2005, Crime Branch of Mumbai Police has launched a novel scheme called Rehabilitation of First-Time Juvenile Offenders in collaboration with NGOs to reduce crime amongst young offenders. Under this scheme, the police keep contact with the community and with the support from the community. The police identify the youth who are first-time offenders and give them an opportunity to reform. Similarly, Rajasthan Police since last 5 years has been initiating programs for the reformation of professional criminals, particularly youth and men from ex-criminal tribes. A combination of strategies is adopted by the police bring about this transformation in criminals. These included counseling by the police, social workers and religious groups, providing basic amenities in the helmets with the help of voluntary organizations and administration to win their confidence, extending the benefits of various poverty alleviation and developmental schemes of the government to them. Most of them do not hold even a below poverty line card. This is the difficulty, which entails them to the benefits of welfare scheme reserved for the poorest. With the help of the department concerned, getting them employment as drivers, labor, chowkidars, etc. in business establishment, sending their children to school and arranging books and uniform for them. Now, I will come to the present situation of the aftercare programs. According to Ahmed, 2012, one of the most critical periods in the life of one who has been a prisoner is that which immediately follows his release from prison. The longer is his period of confinement, the greater are his woes in the prospects of rehabilitation. The monotonous routines of a restricted living disorient him completely for the social life in a free community. His family is in a disarray and mostly friends desert him. He has no money and no one to fall back upon. People shun him. The simple fact that he has been in prison, the stigma of imprisonment follows him at all points of life. He applies for a job but is received with suspicion. He decides to enter a service and fills up a form but stumbles at the column, "Have you ever been arrested or convicted?" No one is prepared to believe him that he how wants to lead an honest and hard-working life and is making fresh and honest efforts for living the life of a normal citizen. The humiliation of prison life often denudes a person of self-respect and self-reliance. He is like a handicapped person convalescing from a crippling accident of crime and trying to learn to walk on his own feet. What he needs is aftercare and rehabilitation. Now, I will summarize the whole module. According to Ahmed, he has observed that in a paper that, I quote, at present there is no legal support by which a released prisoner can automatically be benefited by government or from other sources. Some laws like the Law for Offenders Rehabilitation Services 1995 of Japan or some similar acts as prevalent in other advanced countries may go a long way in the augmentation of rehabilitation programs. The All India Committee on Jail Reforms 1983, which is also known as Mullah Committee, also strongly recommended that aftercare of discharged prisoners from prisons and allied institutions should be a statutory function of the Department of Prisons and Correctional Services. Prison officers should be trained as to how they can help the prisoners for their rehabilitation from the initial days of their imprisonment. They should be equipped with guidance and counseling skill to facilitate legal assistance to indigenous prisoners, help them to keep contacts with their families, pursues the community to accept them back and maintain liaison with voluntary organizations who will in turn help the prisoners for their rehabilitation. Police officers, particularly at the grassroots level, should also be trained as to how they should deal with released prisoners and to facilitate their resettlement in social life. A team of well-trained officers should be appointed in the headquarters of every state who will evaluate, monitor and coordinate the rehabilitative activities. They will maintain a continuous liaison with voluntary organizations working in the field of aftercare and rehabilitation of prisoners released from the correctional institutions. Planning for aftercare should begin the day the inmate enters the institution. At the same time, the number of aftercare institutions and organizations should also be raised. Both voluntary and governmental organizations for aftercare and follow-up work should be adequately equipped both infrastructurally and technically to make them discharge their duties. Voluntary workers engaged in aftercare should be provided with necessary training, encouragement, help, guidance and incentives to help them perform their job properly and also sustain their interest. The prison's struggle to achieve reform ideal would be fruitless as long as prisons continue to be manned by ill-trained, ill-equipped, low-paid, disgruntled, non-professional personnel, many of whom seem to appear with a low morale and simple wish their time and strictly as conform to the prison rules and regulations in a ritualistic manner. The prison guards, at least a majority of them, are the worst of the lot. Some of them are sadistic, brutal, filthy and corrupt in their relationship with the prisoners. It is these guards who abuse the keepers' authorities and continue to exploit the system to the maximum disadvantage of both. Prisons cannot be reformed as long as the prison keepers as a group remain unreformed. To reform them is the essential to launch a massive personal development program in prisons and endorse a philosophy of recruitment that aims at selecting people who are humane in their outlook, incorruptible and dignified in their approach to prisoners. Such men are difficult to find, no doubt, but it can be hoped that such men can be available if the remunerative skills of the different kinds of prison keeping jobs are sufficiently attractive in accordance with the technical or professional qualifications they possess. The solution to the problem of reformation and rehabilitation does not lie with the prison administrator alone. In fact, it lies with the penal policymakers and the judges who somehow still believe that their job is better done if the criminals they apprehend and prove guilty are sent to prison. The prison in their conception is the warehouse of human waste material whose society wants to remove both out of sight and out of mind. This approach is now rightly criticized and viable alternatives to imprisonment are being looked into. The burden of prisons can be reduced only when majority of the short-termers and petty criminals are either released on probation or acquitted after paying the fines. A liberal policy of release on parole would also result in reducing the prison population subsequently. The recent clamor for community corrections is a right direction that will solve many of the ills of the present criminal justice system in India. The crux of the matter is that despite a lot of thinking and ideas which have been generated during the 20th century regarding the development of aftercare services for the released offenders, existing aftercare infrastructure gives a rosy picture. These services have been remained limited to give temporary shelter and meager financial assistance only few discharged prisoners. Although discharged prisoners its societies are doing this task in piecemeal manner, but these are unable to show tangible result due to poor accountability mechanism on concerned government officials and lack of public support. The recommendations made by the Advisory Committee on Aftercare in 1955 have not yet been properly implemented. More recently, Model Prison Manual 2016 has strongly recommended for evolving a structured network of aftercare services for different categories of offenders on the basis of their rehabilitation needs. The Juvenile Justice Act has kept a clear-cut provision for sound aftercare base for the institutional juvenile offenders. In spite of all these adequate infrastructural facilities for the aftercare services in the states have not been properly developed. As a result, not only the basic objectives of therapeutic approach to crime prevention is being defeated, but also the entire efforts involving massive manpower and huge expenditure towards the correctional endeavor are being wasted. In spite of all these adequate infrastructural facilities for the aftercare services in the states have not been properly developed. As a result, not only the basic objective of therapeutic approach to crime prevention is being defeated, but also the entire efforts involving massive manpower and huge expenditure towards the correctional endeavor are being wasted. Thank you.